Our focus for this presentation is the geography of Caribbean South America, and Caribbean South America is the part of South America that touches the Caribbean. So it's all of these 5 countries and territories. So those are the 5 that we're going to focus on for this presentation. And so you need to fill in your map section on your notes, but the 5 countries are Colombia, and Colombia is right here. And you may think it's misspelled on mine, but it is not. Actually, on the map, they spelled it wrong. It's Colombia. And so Colombia is that first one that's connected to Central America, and then Venezuela is the next big one right next to Colombia. And then the 3 small ones over on the eastern side are Guyana, Suriname, and French Guiana, all in that order. And Guyana and Suriname are their own countries, whereas French Guiana is actually part of France. It's a protectorate of France. And so the reason it's called, or we call it Caribbean South America, is because the northern border of all of these countries touch the Caribbean Sea. Okay, so now we'll start talking about the physical features of this region. And the physical features include, first off, the mountains. The mountains are called the Cordilleras. Okay, we've heard that term before, Spanish term for mountains. And so the Cordilleras are mostly in the western part of this region and mostly in Colombia. They have Cordillera Occidental, Cordillera Oriental, and Cordillera Central. And so I'm going to draw those in real quick, but they come up off of the Andes, and the Occidental is the west, and the Central's right there, and then the Oriental goes over here. Okay, and so there's the Andes Mountains splits into 3 different sets of mountains, which are what these Cordilleras are. Now I'm going to erase that. The central range in there is a volcanic range, and so, it can be tough for living sometimes, especially if they're active volcanoes, but because they have been active volcanoes in the past, it's very fertile soil. The ashes come in to the soil and given it extra nutrients, and so it's really good for coffee plants. Okay, really good land for coffee plants to be grown. In between each of these mountains are a couple of big rivers, the Cauca River and the Magdalena River. And so if you remember, I can do it again. I'll draw the mountains in there again. Okay, there's one, and then a central one, and then the one that goes out here. So now in blue, I'll draw in the rivers, and the rivers are the Cauca, which goes in through here, okay, into that valley between the mountains, and then the Magdalena is the river that goes into the other valley between the mountains. And so this again is mostly Colombian rivers. And then just to the east of that, just in this area, which I'll circle in red, is the Llanos. Okay, or I'm sorry, not Llanos, the Llanos. If there's a double L in Spanish, it says like a Y sound. So the Llanos are just past the Cordilleras, just to the east of them, and they're a flat lowland plain, kind of like the Great Plains of the United States, or the interior plains of Canada. If you push out further east, there are a couple of things. The major river in the northern part of South America, in the Caribbean or South America, is the Orinoco River, and it's one of the longest rivers in South America. Amazon River is longer than it, but it is the major river up in the very northern part in these countries. And so it goes through the Guiana Highlands. And the Guiana Highlands, I have a picture right here of what they look like, but they're essentially a big plateau. And so it's flat on the top, but it's like cliff sides on the, or cliffs on the sides. And so it's this very, very high elevation, almost like a flat topped mountain that's happening there, but it's more technically a plateau. The Guiana Highlands are mostly on the east side. It starts in the edge of Venezuela, and then it runs out through Guyana, Suriname, French Guiana, all through that eastern part. In the Guyana Highlands and connected to the Orinoco River is this particular picture is of the waterfall here. And the waterfall here is called Angel Falls. And Angel Falls, I believe it's on your notes. If not, make sure you add it. But Angel Falls is the longest, the highest uninterrupted waterfall in the entire world. And so you see it goes all the way from the top of the highlands all the way to the bottom without, having a small chunk where it's another river that goes a little further and, without stepping its way down. So it's the biggest one in the entire world. That's why it's famous. Okay. Then over to the east, a little bit further in French Guiana and Suriname, you see by the ocean where there's swamps and some saltwater grasses that are way out east. And we'll talk about some of the animals that show up in there a little bit later in this presentation. Take the time right now to quiz yourself and just check and make sure you know this, but where these countries are. And so point to Venezuela, point to French Guiana, point to Colombia, point to Suriname, and point to Guyana. The climates are going to be pretty similar to the ones we just talked about in Central America because it's pretty near there. It's either near or on the equator. The entire area is near or on the equator. As you can see down here, that red line runs right through the top of South America, right through a lot of it. And so most of it is really, really close, even closer than Central America is. And so temperatures are high basically everywhere, and they stay high throughout the year. And so Colombia has a tropical wet climate, so it's always warm and there's year-round rain, so you're going to see a lot of rainforests and things like that. The other 4 countries that are further out to the east, so again, Colombia is like right here, and all of them that are out here are tropical wet and dry. So they're always hot, but they have a wet season and a definite dry season in the winter. So if you look, there is one spot in the very far north of Venezuela that is a desert. And so there is a desert in that area with an arid or dry climate where they don't get very much rain. And so, like I said, there are many rainforests throughout the region, and there are rainforests in Colombia. In Colombia, throughout the rainforests, which are kind of interesting, it's unique plant and animal life. And so you see many, many plants. Rainforest is known as, kind of like a pharmacy, a nature's pharmacy or something, where there's all kinds of plants that can help you with things that make you sick or, hurt or whatever. So it's almost like medicinal plants. But there are also some unique animals there. One of these animals is right here. It's the jaguar. Okay, and so the jaguar is it's a big cat. And it spends a lot of its time in trees, and so it will hunt from above and pounce down to grab whatever it wants. Okay, Coatimundi is another one. The Coatimundi is, I'll get rid of that. And this one right here, it kind of looks like a raccoon. It's in the raccoon family. It's a new animal that was just, it's probably not a new animal. It's probably been around for a while, but it was just discovered not too long ago. And then the next one is the giant anteater, and you can see this guy right here is the giant anteater, and he goes around looking with his really long sticky tongue, looking for ant holes to put his tongue down and eat up a bunch of ants. And then last but not least is the tapir, and that's a picture of what the tapir looks like. It's kind of in the same type of family as a pig. Okay. And so, in the llanos, there are grasslands, and in the grasslands you see capybaras, and capybaras are the largest rodent in the world, and we'll see a capybara and we'll see an anaconda, and we'll actually see an anaconda eating a capybara on a video that we'll watch in class. But anyways, it's the largest rodent, and they're very big. They're almost like think of like a rat except for the size of a small horse or a really large dog. And so kind of crazy to think about, but they're also 26 foot. They grow up to 26 foot, the anacondas. And so you have to think about as far the entire distance of my classroom from the front wall to the back wall, plus add on about 6 or 8 feet to be able to hit the same length that these anacondas, these giant snakes are. And these are snakes that are not poisonous, but instead will wrap up their prey and squeeze them until they squeeze all the oxygen out of them and they die, and at which point they'll eat them. But moving on further east, really what's living there depends on if it's the dry season or the wet season. When it's the dry season, it's a swamp, and so there's kind of, there's a lot of water standing and stuff like that, but you can move around it. There's some dry land as well. Whereas when it's flooded, it's in the wet season, it's completely water. So you got to think of like a forest where the floor, instead of being dirt, is water. And so it's where a lot of time during that time of year, the crocodiles and the otters live there, and they do a lot of their hunting because they can eat the fish and they can surprise animals above the water because they're both good swimmers in that respect. So the next question is, how did the people get into this region? How did they start to move to where people were living throughout the area? Well, what happened is the Europeans came in and lived on the coast first, and so they lived out right on the edges, right by the ocean. And the reason they did that is because trade is super important, and so they definitely wanted to be able to get to the ocean so that they could move the things that they found or the resources that they were harvesting off back to England and back to Europe, back to Spain. All right, and so trade was super important, but the other thing was they were afraid of the disease and the huge insects and weird things that they had seen, bugs like this and like this that are found in South America, that kind of wigged them out, freaked them out, and they realized that they could die from getting bit by some insects. And so they were a little bit scared of that, so they kind of stayed out on the edge and never strayed very far into the rainforest. However, some people started to move in and follow the rivers, and they found the highlands. And the highlands are the places where it's a little bit cooler, but the soil is still really good. And so you've got that volcanic ash in there, but also cooler temperatures, which allow people to really kind of farm and do all the things that you want to do and live in relative comfort, be pretty comfortable in there. So a lot of people moved in there next to the highlands. In the Cordilleras, still to this day, there are just not very many people. When they were being established and being set up, it was hard to live within close to the Cordilleras because you couldn't move to the east or the west. Right? It's not like they had a helicopter. You had to climb a mountain to get to another village that might be not that far east of you. And so the Cordilleras are a place where you're very isolated, and so people did not live there, and still to this day don't live there very often. So then where do people live now? In Colombia, and you can see it all on this map, but in Colombia, which again is this one, okay, in Colombia, you see that 80% of the people live in those highland areas, kind of in the Andes, for cooler temperatures. And so most of the major cities, the cities of Bogota and Medellin and Cali, are all in the higher areas, slightly higher in those highlands, not in the Cordilleras, but in the higher areas near the Cordilleras. Along the Caribbean coast, so also up on the edge, there are some busy cities as well. So you can see it's kind of all concentrated throughout those mountains and then right up by the edge of the sea. In Venezuela, the largest city in the entire area in Caribbean South America is Caracas, Venezuela, and it's the national capital. And in Venezuela, it's one of the most urban societies in the world. So most of the people that live there live in the cities, and we're talking like 90% of the people that live in Venezuela live in the cities. And then if we want to look from there to Guyana, Suriname, and French Guiana, they're really pretty small populations, all of them, and they live in cities near the coast. So in like the lowland areas that are close to the Caribbean Sea. So let's talk about the economies next and the land use itself. French Guiana, Guyana, and Suriname have huge commercial farms. So these giant farms and those big farms that are owned by people outside of the country are mostly creating crops that are for export, so cash crops. They're not expecting to eat these things, they're expecting to sell them for money. And these cash crops that are common in this region are sugar cane to make sugar, bananas and rice, because what they can do is they can take this soggy land that is mostly underwater and they can drain it, and then underneath that land or underneath that water there's this very fertile soil from all of the water things leaking nutrients into it. Okay. Venezuela, however, is not good land for farming. Not even close to good land for farming. It's terrible. Only about 13% of the people in all of Venezuela are in agriculture, are growing things. The most important thing, the absolute most important thing to the economy, is that Venezuela is sitting on huge oil reserves. They have tons and tons and tons of oil. And so it is the only thing keeping the Venezuelan economy going at any time. Okay, and so you see a lot of different oil wells and things like that. The biggest area that is taking oil right now is right around Lake Maracaibo, and you guys will read on Actively Learn a little bit more about Lake Maracaibo and some of the environmental issues happening because of the oil. In Colombia, only about 2% of the land is good to be used for farming, but it's kind of interesting because more people actually farm there than do in Venezuela because they don't have the huge oil export. So even though the land's not that great, a lot of people are using that 2% of land, and so they do most of their farming for export. And again, you see coffee being a major export from Colombia, bananas, as well as flowers. Many of the flowers that you guys will see on Valentine's Day in all the stores will be fresh cut from Colombia and brought up to the United States. The things that they grow in country to be sold to the people of this or of Colombia are sugarcane, cocoa beans to make chocolate with, oilseed, corn, and tobacco, and a lot of that is sold within the country, and they make their money in that way. Now, there are different crops. They're able to grow different crops at different elevations in the mountains, but they have to grow them on these very, very steep side hills. And so what ends up happening is if you're on a very, very steep hill and you're trying to put a tractor on there, that tractor might just roll and tip over. The soil might fly out or erode out from under it as soon as there's water. There's lots of issues that come with trying to farm on a place that's not flat land. And so what they use in Colombia and other countries is terraced farming. So not like terrorist, but terraced. Here's the word right here. Okay, farming. And what that is they actually carve the land. They dig out the land and they make it into looking into like steps. And so they put it into these different levels or these different steps that are usually at least wide enough for their tractors to go on, and they now have a big space of flat land instead of a useless space where they couldn't farm at all. And so there's lots of different levels too, and so if it's too cold at the top of the mountain for sugarcane, then you could grow potatoes at the top of the mountain. On each level, theoretically, you could grow something different if you really wanted to. And so as the climate changes, as you go up and the temperature gets lower, you can change to different crops. So they are a diverse people to look at the culture of this area. There are hardly any purely native people left. Most of them died as the Europeans came in, disease spread, all that kind of stuff. And then after that, after most of them died, the rest of them mostly intermarried with other types of people, whether it's African Americans or Indian people or Chinese or whatever. Whoever was over there, the immigrants, they intermarried with them, therefore taking away those purely native peoples. Now, the immigrant groups that are really common in this area are the Maroons. The Maroons are an interesting group because they're descended from Africans, and the Africans were brought over during slavery. And they actually ran away from their masters and ran into the rainforest, which was very similar to the types of place where they survived in Africa, and so they were able to survive in that environment better than they were in the United States. So big groups of slaves escaped and they got together and created this whole new ethnicity called the Maroons, which were the people that were from Africa and got together in South America to just try and survive. There are also throughout Guyana and Suriname, there are many Indian people. Hindustani, we'll learn about them a little bit, but people actually from India, not Native Americans, but people from India, as well as many Chinese and Javanese people who have moved there as well. And Javanese, that's not a typo, I don't mean Japanese. It's people from the biggest island in Indonesia. The island is called Java. And so you can see down here what a Javanese person looks like. It looks like almost like a Hawaiian person, the same type of culture. They come from the same type of culture.